Thank you everybody for joining us. I think pretty much everybody here knows what One Day Sooner does and what we're about, but I think the important reminder is that, we're willing to volunteer to be infected with a deadly virus, but it's so that people everywhere have a vaccine. It's so that this is accessible, so that, not just so that pharma companies can get rich, not just so that one set of people who are going to get vaccinated anyway have access to that, or who are going to be safe anyway get to stay safe. And, so part of this larger question, obviously, is that there's a limited supply right now and, for the foreseeable future. So this is a question of, the title is Who Gets It First? That's sort of just a catchy title. Broader question is these questions of prioritization and distribution. And one of the reasons that, that the team who helped develop the event, we chose the format that we did, where we did this series of videos over the holidays, and now we're having this, a panel and discussion, is because this is a question that really has a lot of answers. There are so many people in the world who are deserving of a vaccine, who need vaccines as quickly as possible. You heard Lewis say that it's the least among us. There are so many different groups around the world that for whom that's true. But the other reason why I think this is really important is that there are so many questions these days that, I think we wrestle a lot with when there are two sides to a story, when there are multiple sides to a story, and when there's sort of right and wrong. But this is a question, I think, that really fosters discussion. It really gets us thinking and gets us thinking critically about our values and what we want our world to look like. Vaccination, I think, is just one aspect of that. Although that's the professor in me on my other job, that's what I do. So you guys are all my students this semester. So there's a lot of obvious answers that you will have heard in some of those videos. Healthcare workers should get it first. The elderly, people with pre-existing conditions get it first. But there's so many other ways to look at this question. And that's exactly what our panelists are going to do with us this evening. So I will introduce them in just a second, as Danny indicated. After this introduction, each panelist will have a couple minutes to talk about their position. Lena is going to be introducing a brand new position for us. Then we'll have some Q&A with me. I'll give them each one or two questions to continue elaborating on these thoughts. And then we'll have these breakout rooms. Then we'll come back for some final thoughts. And definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat at any time. And especially if you have technical questions, throw them towards Danny. AB is also sort of on standby to do those things. So just to give you the one sentence bios for each of our panelists, and this is the order that they'll be speaking in. Lewis Conway is a national campaign strategist for the American Civil Liberties Union. Lena Jewler is a social and behavioral scientist working at Johns Hopkins. She also works with One Day Sooner on the equity campaigns. And Luke Gibson is the campaign coordinator for the People's Vaccine Alliance. So with that, Lewis can get us started, and then Lena, and then Luke.
Thank you so much. And to our guests and my fellow speakers, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for allowing me to bring the argument for why people incarcerated in jails, prisons, detention centers who should get the vaccine first, and communities of color, Black and brown people, given the current scarcity of COVID-19 vaccines. To lay out my position, firstly, the best vaccination is decarceration. I don't want that to be missed as we talked about the vaccination and the effect that decarceration can have on saving lives when we talk about jails, prisons, and detention centers. However, we already know how COVID has ravaged communities of colors, undeserved communities, and communities that have had historically less access to life-saving healthcare options. And as we wrestle with this notion of what is happening in our prisons, jails, and detention centers, how many lives have been lost? How many people have been infected and are at risk of infection? How important do you think a vaccine is to them? I did 8 years in prison in a 6x9 cell. And let me tell you that there is no way to socially distance when two people are in a 6x9 cell. And even when I was in a lower custody situation and we were housed in hangars that were filled with cubicles, filled with 4 people and 2 per cubicle, there's no way to socially distance. So knowing that this disease affects Black and brown communities at the same rate mass incarceration does should give us pause. Enough of a pause to imagine that across the globe, people who are most affected by COVID-19 are people of color. The data that we have access to leads us to the top line conclusion that, failure to reduce the jail population, that's going to continue to be the Achilles heel. But the widespread use of an effective vaccine is generally regarded by public health experts as the only way to definitively end the current pandemic and adequately protect public health. So, however, at this stage, somewhat of the question remains if folks should continually be punished by death because we don't think they should have access to vaccines. For some reason, we think poverty should equal death because poor folks don't have proper access to the vaccine. And somewhere in our minds, we still don't believe that because across the globe, people of color are the ones most impacted by this insidious disease. There's still a question about who should be first. I want to say that in this moment, when I talk about incarcerated people and people of color, I'm talking about elderly people. I'm talking about frontline workers. I'm talking about, because frontline workers they're part of the working poor. And they're part of the communities that are most impacted. And so I end by saying that, at this moment, I encourage us to think about the folks that have historically had least access. And I encourage us to think about the best of us, the best in us, to look out for those that don't have as much. Thank you.
All right, so for those who watched my video, you'll know that my initial argument was similar to Lewis, but he's much more of an expert in the topic than I am. So I am proposing a different idea tonight. And that's based on kind of this idea that in a better world, we would have already vaccinated incarcerated populations. And I fully agree with what Lewis is saying here. And I think what Luke is going to talk about tonight as well. But I want to kind of think about the way that this vaccine rollout has gone so far. And I think, most of us have seen that it's been a bit of a mess. Particularly recently, there have been a lot of articles about, oh, this couple, flew to the Yukon, pretended to be elderly indigenous folks and got a hold of vaccines. Or doctors are putting family members, saying that they're on their staff so they can get early vaccines as healthcare workers. There's all sorts of ways that the privileged, the wealthy are managing to get their hands on this vaccine earlier than they otherwise should. So the question is, kind of how do we handle this imperfect system that we're currently living in? And one proposal that's been put forward by a behavioral economist, Richard Thaler, is that we in fact do sell vaccines to the highest bidder. But in this controlled situation where individuals would pay to be a part of a lottery, to in an auction for vaccine doses for themselves, for their families. You could expand this idea and think about maybe the NBA wants to purchase doses for the entire National Basketball Association, everyone affiliated with that. There's all sorts of people who would be willing to pay a lot of money for these vaccines early. And rather than letting them kind of slip through and weasel their way into vaccine access, if we formalize it into an auction, we could then raise the money that could be used to distribute those vaccines to the least of us. So whether that be people of color in the United States, whether that be residents of low-income countries who aren't expected to have access to the vaccine until maybe 2022, 2023, whether that's incarcerated folks, whatever your population of interest is, this proposal is a way that we can get them vaccines sooner. So that's the thought experiment, the proposal that I want to present tonight.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lena and Lewis, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this event one day sooner. It's a real privilege to be able to speak on this panel with the other panelists. I'm just going to share my screen quickly because I've got a slide I want to show you guys while I'm talking through. I think you guys should be able to see that now. So just to get started, I think the first thing to say is that there are massive issues in getting this vaccine to some of the poorest countries in the world. So the People's Vaccine Alliance did some new research in December of last year, and we found that 9 out of 10 people in the poorest countries in the world are currently going to miss out on a COVID vaccine in 2021. So that's only 1 in every 10 people living in the global south is due to get a COVID vaccine this year. Now, at the People's Vaccine, we strongly believe that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So COVID anywhere is a problem everywhere. And it's not the case that we can vaccinate our own populations and then it's okay if COVID remains unchecked in other countries, because as we've seen in the news recently, there can be mutations and new strains, and it's going to have a massive impact on public health systems and economies around the world. I think the critical point I want to make today is that we don't have to compete for these vaccines. There can be enough vaccines for everyone. And I don't disagree with anything that the first panelist said about making sure that we get this vaccine to marginalized communities, including incarcerated populations. But it doesn't have to be a case of us versus them. There can be enough for everyone. And the way we can do that is to make sure that pharmaceutical corporations share the science, technology, and know-how behind their vaccines with the world. And I'll be more than happy to talk in the question and answer session about how we can do that. Now, I'm part of a growing global movement that's calling for a people's vaccine, and we want that to be free at the point of use for everyone, everywhere, including the most marginalized populations in the world. Now, as I've said, we feel that there can be enough vaccines for everyone everywhere, and there doesn't need to be vaccine scarcity. We can solve this problem if we work together and pharmaceutical corporations put aside their profit for the global common good. However, in terms of prioritizing while manufacturing is getting boosted, the People's Vaccine Alliance supports the World Health Organization's equitable allocation framework. And that essentially prioritizes the most vulnerable groups in society. And those are classified as health and care workers, people over the age of 60, and those that have chronic conditions. So just before wrapping up, I just wanted to repeat the central point that I don't think we need to be in competition. There doesn't need to be competition within countries, and there doesn't need to be competition between countries on who gets this vaccine. If pharmaceutical corporations put aside their pursuit for profit and openly shared their vaccines with the world, we could make sure that there are enough vaccines for everyone. And just a quick plug, if you'd like to find out more about the People's Vaccine Campaign, you can check out the website there or follow us on Twitter, and there's a lot more information there. And yeah, really excited to proceed with the discussion. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I'm just gonna throw, I think, one question at each of the panelists, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. So you'll have the opportunity to pick one of those and continue the conversation with one of the panelists and a One Day Sooner staff member. So I'm going to start with Lena. Where does the money go? Who gets to spend the money?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? Like, obviously, there's a lot of room to explore this idea. It's not something that's been put in place yet. You know, so at this point in the United States, it's the government who has control of the vaccine supply. So I think the most practical solution is to have, you know, the U.S. government either do that themselves or probably appoint some other entity to kind of deal with that issue for them. Who would be kind of the deciding group. I would hope that they would kind of follow some of these frameworks put out by groups like the World Health Organization, as Luke mentioned, to figure out what to do with those vaccines once they're purchased and who they should go to. But yeah, that would be my answer there.
Would we allow someone like the Gates Foundation to buy up a whole bunch and do the auction themselves?
If the Gates Foundation wants to do that, like, you know, they're well positioned. I think at this point, I guess my argument is we're in crisis mode, we're in crunch time. There's a lot of things we could have done to prepare ahead of time, but they haven't panned out. So at this point, you know, whoever's got the money and whoever's got the means, like, have at it.
All right. Okay, my next question is for Lewis. Do you have concerns about informed consent in vaccinating incarcerated people?
That's a fair concern. As a matter of fact, mandating vaccines is a concern. I, you know, my argument has always been about access, right, as opposed to the actual choice and decision. I think that's an individual thing that, you know, folks deserve the right to choose, but they should have access. And so, you know, following on what Lena has said, you know, I'm of the belief that we shouldn't be paying for vaccines at this point. You know, back when World War I and World War II happened, the steel industry kicked in and created ships and created, America went to work for America. And I think in this day and age, we have to begin to think about the world going to work for the world. And that means not only should folks have access, but price point and the cost analysis should not even be part of our calculus.
All right, I'll put the last question to Luke. So I think a lot of people in this room probably know a little bit about COVAX in particular. So COVAX is another approach to equitable allocation involving advanced market commitments, particularly from wealthy countries, that will then benefit low-income countries. Why is people's vaccine a better approach than one like COVAX?
That's a really brilliant question, Mabel. So yeah, as you mentioned, there are other knowledge sharing initiatives already, such as COVAX. And for those of you joining that don't know, COVAX is an initiative led by 3 global organizations, including Gavi, CEPI, and the World Health Organization. So COVAX is currently the only global mechanism for pooling demand for COVID-19 vaccines to try and secure access for poorer countries. And while we'd say it's really encouraging that many countries have already agreed to work together, rich countries continue to cut bilateral supply deals with pharmaceutical companies, and this completely undermines this global effort and limits the supply available to poorer nations. There's also some other issues with COVAX in that it's not been very transparent about the deals it's making with pharmaceutical companies and remains completely silent on how it's going to break up big pharmaceutical monopolies, which have been the big issue behind all of this discussion. There's also some other issues around transparency on decision making and letting developing countries have a say in strategic decisions. So we think that a better approach that could be taken is backing the CTAP, and that is the COVID-19 Technology and Access Pool, and that is also a World Health Organization initiative. And what that essentially means in a nutshell is that pharmaceutical companies would share the science, technology, and know-how behind their vaccines with this mechanism, and that could then be shared with manufacturers around the world, including in the global south. And there's many manufacturers who are ready to scale up production. This would mean that there was a flood of COVID-19 vaccines around the world and would make sure that everyone everywhere could get access to a vaccine.
Can we trust the WHO to administer something like CTAP?
I think we really welcome the role that the WHO has already played in setting up CTAP, and it is a big step in the right direction to try and kind of break through these monopolies that pharmaceutical companies have on intellectual property, and also some of the other issues around vaccines, because it's not just a case of intellectual property. Also, some of these vaccines, you need quite specific science and technology to produce them, and this is what the CTAP is trying to address. Now, we would argue that Dr. Tedros, who's the head of the World Health Organization, and senior figures need to put their political backing behind CTAP, because every time there is a news story about vaccine access, the WHO is great at calling for access to this vaccine in the global south, but they always claim that COVAX is the only solution. As I've just outlined, we think that COVAX is a step in the right direction, but it's actually CTAP that is going to ensure that we get this vaccine to everyone, everywhere.
All right, and I'll throw, since we still have a little bit of time, I'll throw one more to Lewis that came up in the chat, which is curious to hear if there are differences in getting vaccines to incarcerated people in private versus public prisons.
That's a good question, and I can't answer it from a place of information or informed, so I don't want to answer that without proper information, so I don't know.
But another answer and question that I think, like the question I asked Lena, reminds us of how many different mechanisms that are operating at so many different levels in our society, making decisions for people and often not letting people make decisions for themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
No. I was, and that's why I led with, decarceration, the best vaccination, as we think about jails being revolving doors of mass incarceration, reducing arrest for minor crimes. Right, there are many ways for us, to think about vaccinating the public through action as opposed to injection.
So we're gonna head into breakout rooms now. And Danny, do you want to add anything other than what you shared with us earlier?
Nope. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop it in the chat box, but I will open the breakout sessions now.
Yeah, so just say the question was along the lines of the People's Vaccine Alliance asks and advocacy work being quite ambitious. And the question was around, do we actually feel that those objectives are achievable, or are we trying to kind of push the Overton window? So kind of trying to push to in our direction, the general conversation. So it's more likely we get something that we want. And hi, Jennifer, great to see you here. So just to answer that, so yeah, we have two key objectives as the People's Vaccine Alliance. And I was just on a call earlier with the whole alliance to actually explain our campaign objectives for the first quarter. So the first one, as I just outlined, is trying to get one pharmaceutical company or research organization to sign up to the CTAP. Now, that is an ambitious ask, but we also think it is potentially achievable, especially on the research institution side. So, for example, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but the AstraZeneca vaccine, the intellectual property actually rests with Oxford University, and they were behind the development of the vaccine. And I can't go into too much detail, but we are already in discussions with a few of these different groups, and a lot of them have made warm signals that they would be interested, at least in exploring joining CTAP. So we're really keen to try and push them in the right direction. I think it is ambitious that one of them will do so in the first 3 months of the year. But I think if we can apply the right pressure, especially with publics and with shareholders and with investors, we could make that happen. Now, the second objective of the People's Vaccine Alliance is all about challenging public perceptions, especially in the UK and the United States, which is where a lot of the pharmaceutical companies are headquartered. And what we want to do is firstly increase awareness that there are these access issues in the global south. As I said in my presentation, 9 out of 10 people in poorer countries are currently due not to get a COVID vaccine. Now, the second thing that we're trying to challenge the perceptions of, especially in richer countries, is the idea that once COVID is solved in our country, then COVID is over. We know that's not true, and we know that no one is safe until everyone's safe, and we have to work together to solve this problem. The third public perception we're trying to change, and something that I think is really key to this discussion, is that there is this vaccine scarcity. There doesn't need to be vaccine scarcity, okay? We can massively ramp up manufacturing production around the world, including in the global south, if pharmaceutical companies share the science, technology, and know-how behind their research. So in answer to your question, Abby, I think it's the case that, yes, our goals are ambitious, but in all honesty, we could have been a lot more ambitious, because I think, yeah, we would argue that the way that the pharmaceutical research and development system works at the moment doesn't work in the favor of those living in the global south, because a lot of the diseases and the treatments that are needed to tackle those, pharmaceutical companies only invest in those if they can see profit. And we think vaccines to issues such as COVID and other issues should really be for the global common good, and they should be made available to everyone free at the point of use. I hope that helps to answer your question.
Yep, very much so. And I have 1,000 follow-ups before I ask them, since I got dibs on the first question. Alicia, Jennifer, or Yele, if any of you have questions, but yeah, definitely go ahead.
Well, if no one will have a go, I will have a go. Yeah, I'm completely agreeing with the idea of the thing, but the question I do have is, well, a lot of these factories are also in Belgium, and Belgium has been investing a lot in infrastructure for these companies. So my question is, if this was to be done, would the infrastructure in the other countries also, they would also need a boost? So how do you see that working out?
It's a fantastic question. So yeah, I think the general question is that it's all very well and good if pharmaceutical companies share the science, technology, and know-how behind their vaccines with the world. But if there isn't that production capacity to make the vaccines, then we're still at square one. Yeah, it's a brilliant question. So I think I'd answer that in two ways. So The first answer to that is that there are factories sitting idle in the global north and south at the moment that are not producing vaccines. So I can't speak to Belgium exactly, but there are many vaccine producers and pharmaceutical companies that have production ready to go for their own vaccines, but they've yet to be approved. And that production capacity is laying idle. So I think you've already seen, I can't remember the exact examples in the news this week, but I think one pharmaceutical company has actually offered to produce the vaccine of another pharmaceutical company. So there is manufacturing capacity in the global north. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. In the global south, there are also manufacturers that have said, as soon as you share the intellectual property with us and the science and technology behind these vaccines, we can produce them. Now, that's not to say that the manufacturing capacity is completely there in the global south at the moment. I think that would be misleading. But I think if manufacturing capacity was to be ramped up, we could make this vaccine available to billions of people this year, and make sure that it's getting to those in the poorest countries in the world. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, because why would you boost manufacturing capacity if you don't have the recipe in terms of how to make the vaccine? So I think the first step is making sure that pharmaceutical companies share the recipes with their vaccines so that it can be produced where that manufacturing capacity exists. Once they do so, I think there needs to be a big push to boost manufacturing capacity around the world, including in the global south, so that we can get this vaccine available to everyone, everywhere. But it's a really good, it's the correct issue to raise. So thanks for bringing that up.
I have a question about the process of, though I already got a question. So if Jennifer, you have a question, go ahead.
Maybe you go ahead.
Okay. My question is all about challenging public perception, and I say this, coming from a communications from Monday Sooner perspective, which is that not to give too much backstory here, but we sort of early on in the challenge trial debate in 2020, we identified public, or rather researchers' perception of public perception of challenge trials as a bottleneck to challenge trials. Basically, researchers were worried that if they did challenge trials, everyone would get really upset. There would be a collapse of trust in science because they would be really upset that these risky trials were going on. And so we wanted to change public perception about challenge trials. And the way we did it was basically through op-eds and media appearances with challenge volunteers saying, I'd be willing to get COVID if it could, help save lives. And so I guess my question is sort of two-pronged. One is how are you going about challenging public perception? Is it through sort of formal media channels, social media, so on and so forth? And the second is sort of what's the goal of, or is there some secondary goal that comes from challenging public perception? Is it that you're hoping to launch petition campaigns and build public pressure, sort of PR concerns from pharmaceutical companies? Is it more just like sort of laying the groundworks of like popular dissent in like the evil mechanisms of capitalism? Or I'm just sort of what so basically a both means and ends question about challenging public perception.
You guys are full of brilliant questions today. Thanks for that, Abby. That's fantastic. Again, we've just been trying to figure this out this week, actually. So on your first question of how are we going about changing public perceptions, I think the first step of that is understanding what public perceptions are. So while there's been some polling, and I think you've alluded to that in some way, there hasn't been polling on all of the core questions that we're asking. So the first step we're going to take is try and do some opinion polling, especially in the UK and the US, to understand where people sit on these issues, and crucially, who within those countries thinks what, right? So we have to be super clear that the United States, for example, is not kind of a homogenous group, right? So within those audiences, there are many different perceptions, and it makes no sense for us to be constantly communicating with people who already believe that a COVID vaccine should be made available to everyone everywhere, or already know that there's vaccine issues in the global south. So a key challenge for us is, once we've identified which audiences we need to move, then think through creatively how can we engage with those audiences. So for example, we've already had massive success in getting our news stories out into some major news networks, including some more liberal channels such as The Guardian or the New York Times, for example. But it may be that many of those audiences already believe what we believe. So we need to think through, how do we get that message out to other audiences? And that can be through a range of methods. It could be through targeted media work. It could be through paid promotion on social media. It could be through offline advocacy, although obviously that's a bit difficult in the current context. And we're really open to exploring all these different methods to reach out to people. But I think the key strengths we have in Alliance at the moment is our media reach and our media capacity, because we have a lot of expertise in this at the moment, and also reaching out to people on social media during the pandemic, when it is a little bit more difficult to do that offline advocacy. Now, while I've been answering the first part of your, I just remembered the second part of your question. So I think your second part of your question was around, it's all very well challenging public perceptions, but what's the point, essentially, like what you're trying to achieve? So it's kind of multi-layered, and I can't give a simple answer to this, but I think the key thing we're trying to do with that is to put pressure on governments. So we will try and put pressure on pharmaceutical companies directly to share the vaccine recipes with the world, but ultimately we think it's likely that governments will need to intervene to use the different levers they have to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies. So it's going to be very difficult to get governments to force pharmaceutical companies to share the vaccine recipes, but they can exert significant pressure for them to do so. So that's a key point. Obviously, governments, it's questionable, but we would like to think they're responsive to their citizens, right? And so a first part of getting governments to move is persuading citizens. Now, in addition, we would also see that would be an opportunity to put public pressure on pharmaceutical companies. But we have to be honest that different pharmaceutical companies respond to public pressure in different ways. So a key part of our challenge is trying to figure out which of these pharmaceutical companies might be likely to budge if public pressure was exerted. So which might be more prone to brand damage, or which, yeah, exactly that. And then thinking through on that basis. So yeah, there's a very long answer to your question, but short answer is ultimately to influence governments and perhaps also to influence pharma.
Great answer, thank you.
Bravo. It just seems like such a huge reach, and that's why I'm here today, because I need to hear from people that have that kind of vision. And trying to hang on to that vision and not think of all the obstacles. Do you have a sense that if one pharmaceutical company signs on to this, that there'll be some domino? I mean, like, is that a big force, do you think?
That is probably the biggest force. I think you've hit the nail on the head, Jennifer. So I'll just be honest. I remember when I started in my role, so I'm kind of the campaigns and media guy. So I'm not actually an access to medicines policy specialist myself. So my first question, I remember this very well. I had a briefing with someone called, I can't remember her surname, Ellen, but she's kind of like someone who's got 30 to 40 years experience engaging on access to medicines issues and advocating with the World Health Organization and other groups. And I'd happily share more information about her after the call. And I remember jumping on a call with her and saying, look, how are we going to make this happen? And she said, Luke, the one way we do this is we get one pharmaceutical company to budge. She strongly believes that once you kind of get that first pharmaceutical company to share their science, vaccine and technology with the world, it then becomes much, much easier to persuade the others, because we just have an example. So all of their arguments around, yeah, but what about our profits? What about X, Y, and Z? Well, if one company's done it, then you guys can do it too. And that also will add significant political momentum behind the initiative. So it's all very well and good for the civil society organization, and there are many of us. So the People's Vaccine Alliance is made up of many kind of 30, 40 major international NGOs, such as Amnesty International, Public Citizen, Oxfam, calling for a people's vaccine. But as soon as it's clear that the private sector and pharmaceutical companies are actually taking this initiative seriously and can engage with it, we would then expect to see a snowball effect. It's not the case that all pharmaceutical companies will suddenly join CTAP, but we would expect that once one has moved, then the others have moved. And that's kind of links to the answer to Abby's question as well, in that we really want to figure out which of these pharmaceutical companies are most likely to move. How do we exert pressure on them? Is it shareholder pressure? Is it investor pressure? Is it employee pressure? Is it media pressure? The list goes on and on and on. So that we can focus down on one or two and try and get them to be first movers. Now, we're in a process at the moment. We have a pharmaceutical advisory group set up where we're reaching out to different people within the alliance and trying to tap into their experience of, you know, how on previous campaigns on access to HIV medicines, for example, what actually worked to persuade these companies to move. And once we've been through that process, we will incorporate that into our campaign planning and then, yeah, try as hard as we can to get them to budge. But I think it's also worth mentioning, sorry, there's another long answer to a simple question, but it's also worth mentioning that I think it does need to involve government. So I would love to think that pharmaceutical companies will do this voluntarily, but I think in addition to public pressure, we also need governments to ramp up the pressure, because they do have significant levers at their disposal to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies and make sure that they take action.
So I think we have like three or so more minutes before we go back to the main group. I'm gonna steal the last question though, which is like, I imagine the main response you get is, oh, but what about incentives to innovate? What's your response to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it kind of links into the question, you know, how do you expect pharmaceutical companies to develop vaccines and treatments if there's no promise of a profit? So I think I need to be clear that we're not suggesting that pharmaceutical companies shouldn't cover the costs or make reasonable profit in normal circumstances. But given that COVID-19 is a global pandemic and we've seen the massive impact this is having all around the world, and given also that most of the research and development costs have been financed in part by public money, we think it would be completely unacceptable for companies to charge the kind of high prices we've seen for other vaccines and medicines. So one corporation, Pfizer, these stats are a little bit out of date, maybe a month old, but it'll be roughly the same. It's currently selling its COVID-19 vaccine candidate for around $40 US dollars for 2 doses. That is an 80% profit margin. I'll say that again, that is an 80% profit margin. Okay, that puts it way beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest countries and also significantly lines the pockets of Pfizer. So as most vaccines and treatments have been funded by taxpayer money, government should have imposed conditions on their funding to demand the removal of patents and other intellectual property barriers and to ensure the open sharing of the vaccine recipes, as we've discussed. And I think we'd argue that in these unprecedented times, we should be aiming to maximize supply instead of maximizing profit for pharma companies. And in the long run, we would support more public investment in vaccine research, because as I said at the start of this session, COVID-19 is a major issue, but we all know that there are other issues in the world, many of which do not get the same level of attention and the same level of research and investment because there isn't as much profit in it. And we need to challenge that system where pharmaceutical companies seek to make profit rather than trying to save people's lives as a priority.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I know, Abby, that Alicia's on the call and she hasn't asked a question yet. Alicia, happy to try and answer a question if you've got one.
Hi, thank you. You know, I don't have any particular question. I just, yeah, I live in the place where Pfizer is located in the US. And so I have that in my, kind of in my background, but also I did work overseas in investment outside the US. And I'm aware of different financial scenarios for vaccine development. So I have more than I could possibly put into a single question because, yeah, it depends on where you are in the world in terms of how the pharmaceutical industry develops vaccines in general. And I had worked in China in the past, and it's a far different enterprise than it is in the US. So, yeah, but thank you. Everyone else's questions again. It's a great discussion and it should be held every day, basically.
And I would be happy to join every day if it wasn't 1 in the morning. It's a little bit early.
Oh my goodness.
Those answers are especially impressive given the time for you. Wow. Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. And it's so interesting to hear what you have to say, Luke.
It was entirely my own fault. I got the time zones wrong. I thought it was 1 in the afternoon, but yeah, I'm so glad I stayed up. So it's been such a great discussion. It's been so fantastic to meet you all. And I know Abby's trying to draw us back into the other group, but just to say huge, on behalf of the campaign, but also personally, like obviously you guys have put your personal health on the line to try and get this vaccine to people as soon as possible. So a huge thank you for everything you've already done. It's a real privilege to be invited to speak to you. So yeah, thanks, and more than happy to come back anytime.
One last word in here, which is that from here on out, the case for challenge trials is pretty much entirely has to do with vaccines for the developing world, since vaccines, first world countries have secured themselves vaccines. So we'll be doing a whole lot of vaccine equity messaging over the next few months, and yeah, I'll definitely be in touch about it.
Yeah, keep going with it. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Luke. Thank you very much.
The easier path of just like working within the system we currently have without resolving these underlying issues. And then we continue to ignore these issues until they are let out of control. And so I don't know. I mean, I would love to know how we can solve these systemic inequalities almost without the context of the crisis in the present crisis. Because I don't think there ever will be a galvanizing force enough to really look into that.
No, upstream is always better. You know, it's just a matter of, you know, oftentimes we don't think upstream until afterthought. You know, we should have done this, right? And so I think that's the case we're now in terms of distribution. As we thought about production, we should have been thinking about distribution. I remember doing debates about the difficulty in storing certain types of vaccination, and how, you know, in Africa, that wouldn't be practical to try to have a frozen, trying to keep the vaccine frozen. So I just think you're right. You know, systemic issues trying to operate within a governmental structure is not the most ideal way. Unfortunately, that's kind of the framework that we have to operate in. And then with such a repressive type of administration where healthcare was not their first concern, you know, as much as taking credit for being the one that brought it, right? And not driven by data.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I don't know. That's
One that brought one vaccine. You know, like I think there's an interesting tension when we talk about a vaccine, the vaccine, or multiple vaccines. I mean, one of the things is that, you know, Operation Warp Speed only invested in 8 vaccines. They could have invested in 20. They could have invested that much money in 20. And, you know, one of them might have been the nasal spray one that is a whole lot easier to get to a whole lot of places. And they made particular choices. You know, they could have invested $100 billion if they'd wanted to.
So I think what you're saying is that if you remove the intent to move on profit, or what brings the most profit, I think you're saying that if we move profit out of the equation, that gives us the creativity to think outside the box.
And also, I mean, I think in this case, I don't know enough about which vaccines were invested in, and why. Like, I mean, and why Moderna crossed the finish line so quickly as opposed to some of the others. I mean, there's certain details that have gotten press, but I'm not sure if that's the whole story. So the question is, right, is what else could the government have done? Because I think there's more. They could have thrown more money, and we all know that, yeah, as you're saying, I don't know if it's removing profit. It's actually saying, no, we'll give you the profit ahead of time. But
well, again, as I was saying, during World War I and World War II, particularly with U.S. Steel, like one of the largest steel corporations, they went to work to build their ships. Now, not to say that they did it for free, but the incentive was not so much about profit as much as we hope there was a patriotism to wanting America to not fall to, you know, forces abroad. However, here, this disease is waging a war on the world, right? And so I think you have to respond in a way that we have to invest in the tools that help us combat that, right? And one of the ways that we have fought wars is by putting troops in certain places. And so we thought about distribution of troops. So we have to think about distribution of our, you know, vaccination plans in a more thorough way that is beyond who gets paid more for, you know, because somewhere there's a patent deal going on, right? So someone got paid for the patents. There's some money to be made and you know, holding that patent and then, you know, replicating that patent. So a lot of the issue isn't issues that are endemic to the process. They're issues that are stemming from profit or from, I'm trying to not say capitalism because I don't want to throw my socialist side, but capitalism, you know, us driving for a profit for people to live, you know, that's amazing.
Can I bring us back to the race and incarceration issues that we started with and make the counter argument on those 2 points, which for me at least, I see those as 2 entirely separate lines of argument. For the incarcerated people, my counter argument would be they are definitionally there to be punished, right? They have been found guilty of a crime. And, you know, part of that is that, yes, they will not get top priority healthcare. And like, I would prefer to see someone who has not been convicted of a crime get a vaccine before someone who has been. The race issues, I would point out that prioritizing by race in the United States, at least, would be massively illegal. It would violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, right, which was passed primarily to protect Black people, right, and for good reason, right? If there's one thing we should have learned from the history of race in the United States, it's that thinking of policy issues in terms of a Black community and a white community, in terms of how it impacts one race versus another, is never, ever a good decision. It never leads to a good place, right? And Ms. Rosenheck made a point about the speed of the Moderna vaccine. Well, the Moderna vaccine would have been here a month earlier if it hadn't been held up by race issues, right? They delayed the trials by 3 weeks to include Hispanic people. Which is not a medically relevant category, right? Genetically, Hispanic people in the United States are basically white people, right? They've got cultural difference, but it is not biological. And so that was just a delay purely on race politics. Bringing race in never helps.
So to rebut or to counter your first point about why incarcerated folks should get the vaccine, so 95% of the people who are currently incarcerated are coming home, right? So those jails, prisons, and detention centers are vectors of infection. As I said, I was in a 6x9 cell with 2 people. So it's not about giving them superior access to healthcare as much as the CDC guidelines say that social distancing is how you reduce the infection rate. You can't social distance in prison. They're coming home. So if we don't vaccinate them, we're doing ourselves a disservice, firstly. Secondly, communities of color encapsulate communities that don't have access to healthcare. So it's not about the race issue as much as it is, it just so happens that Black folks are poor people in America, and Black folks make up the majority of the folks that are highly impacted by COVID. Like, I don't know, that's not a race issue by choice. That's a race issue by studies and data, is that the people who are dying at a higher rate are people who are Black and people who are brown or Latino. To the third point about there being a medically negligible quotient indicated because of that group, right? As if we don't do the complete study, it's almost like when you're told to take 10 days of your antibiotic, but you stop at 7 because you feel better. It's the same thing. If we don't do a challenge trial for everyone, but Latinos, we know, at least in Texas, for certainly, in Texas, there's whole, you know, the whole southern region of Texas is Latinos. And I promise you, they would not agree with you by saying that they are medically negligible, because whole communities have died, right? So I don't think it's a matter of race as much as race kind of encapsulates the people who are most impacted.
I didn't say that Hispanic people were medically negligible. I said that the characteristic of being Hispanic is not a medical characteristic that could possibly interact with a vaccine, and therefore the studies that you run on, you know, other people, white people are basically white people and Hispanic people genetically are almost the same in the United States, right? Well, so this data on white people tells you about how it affects Hispanics too.
That's geographic, my brother, because on the East Coast, that's a little bit different. Like, you know, Latinx folks, you know, we're talking about a wide swath of people. Like, I mean, yes, in some places, in some geographic locations, they do identify as Anglo, right? I'm not certain about the DNA statistics, how much of their ancestry is actually from a European descent. But just because someone identifies as a certain group may not necessarily mean that their DNA identifies them as that same group.
Sure. For the other point about, you said that Black people or poor people, which yes, there's a definite statistical association there in the United States. And I would certainly be open to prioritizing poor people in general, as long as it's not about race.
I mean, I think part of the catch is that we can be incredibly precise. We can say it's not about Black people; it's about a community of people who were, redlined into certain neighborhoods that are heat islands and are food deserts, because that's what we're looking at when we're looking at race inclusion in clinical trials. We're looking at not genetics. We're looking at other environmental characteristics. We're looking at these broader systemic issues. So, I mean, if we want to sit here all day and be really specific as to what categories we're talking about and the ways in which they overlap across races, across other categories, I think it's a great, educational lesson in the history of inequality. And so it's an important question, I think, to consider. Well, if we want to target these groups, what kind of policies do we need? What kind of prioritizations do we need to really address these issues? And I think that hopefully, that's where we get in this conversation, is getting to that point where we consider those things alongside these, proxies that are also real, like race, skin color, things like that.
Elaine and Alistair have been quiet. Oh, there's Alistair. Okay.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say that I think also it's a matter of confidence in that, if the Hispanic community, felt that the vaccine hadn't been tested properly, then there's no way that you're going to see a decent uptake rate. And at the end of the day, that's really, really what matters. There's no point licensing a vaccine if people aren't going to take it. So I think that's the other thing which needs to be considered is, I would say that we don't know enough about the genetic differences between the exact makeup of the Hispanic community. We just don't know enough. And if you don't know, you have to test. That's the point of a trial. If we don't know, we test. So I think it was really, really vital that particularly phase 3 trials just take as a broad cross-section as is possible to get, else you're going to have dodgy trials. And if you have dodgy trials, you're going to have people quite rightly saying, this trial isn't good enough. And if you have people quite rightly saying that this trial isn't good enough, that's one of those things which, particularly these days, is going to get amplified and amplified and amplified by people who then don't really know what they're talking about until you potentially face a real problem with confidence in the vaccine across a huge section of society. And
that's one of the problems we're having with the fact that they did it so fast, right? If they'd taken an extra month to do the whole process, would there have been a mistake?
If I ask 10 of my friends if they're going to take the vaccine, 9 of them have said no. Right? And
I have something to say about that. I know we're going to go in a second, but the first one who should have got the vaccines was all of us who volunteered for human challenge trials. That is the thing. We would have found out, we would have gotten back to it in August when the FDA said they were going to do it. So, I mean, if you really want to argue who should have gotten it first, should have been the volunteers, so we would have had all the information we needed.
I agree with that.
I mean, that's my take on it. Right? You guys agree? I mean, pretty much. I mean, we're all here volunteering, right? Most of us.
I wish the United States did do challenge trials.
I mean, we should have.
And I wish the UK would also do challenge trials.
Don't talk about it, all right?
But don't you wonder why we haven't done it yet? I mean, I'm asking myself the question for months. What's happening? Why are they not employing us? Because they don't have rescue therapy? Everything out there, the vaccines are emergency use authorization. What do you think human challenge trials are? Same thing.
The timing, that was perfect.
Was it? I'm so glad. I'm glad everybody seems to have had a great time in the breakout sessions.
Have my chats been going to everyone, even in different breakout rooms?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I just ignored it. I'm sorry. I saw it.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Oh, I didn't get them. I'm jealous.
I used to Zoom all day and the chat's always active, so I apologize. I just ignored it.
You have to let Lena finish her last sentence.
Thank you.
Weirdly cut off.
Oh yeah, no, I was just plugging a podcast. So if anyone's interested in auction theory and other like allocation schemes, there's a Planet Money episode about the New York Marathon that I would recommend.
Mabel, you're muted.
You're still muted.
Never mind, doesn't matter.
So I'd love to hear about what went on in each breakout session. Does anyone have any like short points they'd like to make before we wrap up?
Quantum vaccine theory is what we, and Alistair came up with an amazing solution, as well as Elaine. They both had. No, it was a very robust and valuable conversation. I think we all agree that distribution, no matter the order, should have been invested in early.
Yeah, I think for a breakout room, I really enjoyed being there, and I think it was very interactive, and it was a brand new idea, and it was fun to kind of trade these thoughts around auctions for vaccines. And if we spend a bit more time on it, I think this is something that could potentially be implementable. Yeah.
Anyone
Just
else?
to say,
Yep.
yeah, we had a fantastic discussion in my group, Danny. I felt a little bit like I was preaching to the converted, because I think most people are on board with the idea that we should have vaccines for everyone everywhere, but lots of great questions about if we do get pharmaceutical companies to share their vaccines, then what? Like, how do we ramp up manufacturing capacity to make sure we can produce them? And then talking about what's kind of like the longer term process of vaccine research and development if pharmaceutical companies are not going to be so central to that. But I did just want to say something that I said in my own breakout session, but just publicly as well, just to say a massive thank you to all of you guys who've kind of put your health on the line to try and make sure we get a vaccine available to everyone everywhere, because, you know, making sure these vaccines were tested and were approved was really the first step. So it's been a real privilege to be invited to speak to you all today, and please do keep up that great work, and more than happy to come back anytime. We had a fantastic discussion, so a huge thank you everyone, and thanks to the other speakers. I really don't want to go after these guys again because they're so impressive. It's such a difficult act to follow, but thank you.
Well, thank you very much. With that, I think we can close out with a fun little poll if people are interested in doing that. And the question is, if you had 3 minutes in an elevator with Joe Biden and 10 of his Secret Service members.
I came up with the question and I forgot what it was.
Which approach are you going to recommend?
Oh, I can't vote because I'm a host.
It prevents you from voting because
Yeah, it only gives me the end poll button.
Oh, that's unfortunate. You can tell us what you would vote for.
If I had 3 minutes with Joe Biden, I think I'd push and suspend intellectual property. I don't think.
At least now you know it's not just me pushing the button 10 times.
Fair point.
I think you push for incarcerated populations, because then you can hope for a ripple or a domino in his thinking around just access in general. So
yeah.
You hit your main target and trigger, hopefully, you know, his imagine, and he's inclined that way anyway. So maybe
I think that was my similar thinking with suspending intellectual property, is that like that would be the earworm I would want to convey, and hope that would get him thinking about like larger global equity and you know, like intellectual property is relevant, you know, to pharmaceuticals in the US too. So
the gateway.
Kind of. Well, it's like with my students, like I try to say one thing that gets them thinking critically, like some spark of a question, and then hopefully it unfurls onto everything else.
Awesome. Here, let me share the results of the poll. The results are in, folks.
Not voted for charity auction.
Lowest percentage wins.
We're suspending intellectual property.
Yay.
Sounds like that's the winner here.
Is that how this works?
Who's spending 3 minutes in an elevator with 11 other people to pitch this now?
Well,
that's the next poll.
Preserving Secret Service gets tested every day, like reliably, and I wouldn't. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know if we can socially distance though with 11 people in the elevator. And that was why I was hesitant to vote.
Yeah.
So.
You know, an excellent point. Think about that.
That was just the acknowledgement that you would never actually be alone with Joe Biden. That was really where that came from. But you know.
You're right.
Yeah, I have a feeling he's thinking about all these things now. He's got Suzanne Rice, I think, looking at a lot of these issues. Be interesting if we could get something to her about some of our ideas.
Does anyone have a connection?
Ask Julia. We're probably 2 degrees away from her based on the volunteers at One Day Sooner, I think.
There's actually lots of members of the Alliance that are based in the US, such as Partners in Health. I'm not sure if you're aware of them, but they have quite good connections with the Biden administration. So I'm always more than happy to put you guys in touch if that would be helpful. Always worth a try.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might just take you up on that.
Yeah.
Amy, is that a One Day Sooner shirt?
Yes, it is. You can get yours. I will put it in the chat in a second, and then I know we can close this as we're almost at time. 1 sec.
Do we have to buy them online?
Yep.
Do we have hats? Baseball hats?
No, but I really like one, and they're quite easy to make.
We're getting the merch ideas.
I can't stress how important mugs are to like my life in general. I really need mugs. I have a mug. I have 2 mugs from the company running the trial in the UK, and I have no mugs from One Day Sooner.
Aww.
So technically, they work. Really embarrassing.
That's so good.
So Amy, you're going to send us all T-shirts tomorrow?
Well, I just linked it in the chat. I should probably share it in our next newsletter. Somehow never occurred to me. I put it in the Slack. But yeah, definitely get your T-shirt. Yeah, they're pretty great.
But the attendees of today, we get a free.
Oh, that's a good incentive to come to our events in the future. Is you get a One Day Sooner T-shirt. I'm not opposed.
I'll put that idea in our list.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. With that, I think we are going to head out. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you all.
Amazing conversation, ending with T-shirts.
Be safe and take care of yourselves.
Yes.
Good job, you guys.
Oh, thank you.